Whether you fought for the North or the South, being a soldier in the Civil War was a harrowing experience. And with wounded, injured, and diseased soldiers being brought in at a rate faster than they could be attended to, Civil War field hospitals were almost as dangerous, chaotic, and stressful as the battlefields themselves. So, today we're going to take a look at what it was like to work in a Civil War hospital. But before we get started, be sure to subscribe to the Weird History channel. After that, leave a comment and let us know what other parts of American history you would like to hear about. Okay, get yourself scrubbed in, because it's time to operate on some weird history. The American Civil War raged from April 12, 1861 to May 26, 1865. The war would ultimately claim the lives of over 1 million Americans, 3% of the country's entire population at the time. Historians have noted that the Civil War claimed more American lives than all other wars the country has fought combined, despite the best efforts of those who worked in the field hospitals. Field hospitals were usually located close to the front lines, sometimes as close as just a mile away, which is a convenient walking distance, provided you hadn't just lost your foot to a cannon blast. If you were a soldier who was injured on the battlefield, a field hospital would be your first stop for medical care. They also tended to be improvised facilities that were set up in local buildings like barns, churches, or even private homes. The field hospitals typically had very little in the way of supplies, particularly in the South. Many of the medications that Civil War doctors needed were manufactured in the northern half of the United States. In order to gain access to these medicines, Southerners had to get creative. Sometimes that meant running Union blockades or smuggling medicines to the South by sewing them into the petticoats of women who were sympathetic to the Confederacy. Surgeries were often performed on whatever flat surfaces were available, like tables or unhinged doors. They were also often performed outdoors, which not only helped to ventilate the extremely unpleasant war wound smell, but also allowed surgeons to use natural daylight during an operation instead of dim candlelight. Which was a good thing, because their eyes were perpetually tired from the sheer amount of surgeries that had to be performed. Nobody was prepared for the unprecedented human toll of the Civil War, so the surgeons wound up treating a lot more patients than anyone was expecting. Overwhelmed physicians often worked themselves past the point of exhaustion, and the circumstances created a generally chaotic and unnerving atmosphere. Patients had little to do but lay around. Some screamed deliriously and called out for loved ones, while others laid around quietly, looking pale from the effects of shock. Sounds like the DMV. Despite the best efforts of the surgeons, the hospitals tended to be perpetually crowded, and living conditions were so unfit for the wounded that many patients ended up perishing simply because of their hospital stay. Civil War soldiers fought in terrible conditions. In fact, twice as many soldiers succumbed to disease than to actual combat wounds. That sounds pretty bad, but it was actually a vast improvement over the numbers from the recent Mexican War, in which there were 7 to 10 disease-related fatalities for every combat fatality. Diarrhea and dysentery were extremely common and responsible for much of the death toll. Other prevalent diseases included measles, smallpox, malaria, pneumonia, and a weird skin condition known as camp itch, which is different from what you got from swimming in the lake that one summer. Luckily, doctors had an array of creative remedies at their fingertips, some of which actually worked. Scurvy was a fairly common problem among Civil War soldiers, and the remedy for it, regular servings of green vegetables, was among the least unpleasant, or most unpleasant, depending on how you feel about peas. Open bowel problems were treated with a plug of opium, while closed bowels were treated with an infamous mixture of mercury and chalk known as the blue mass. Respiratory issues like bronchitis or pneumonia were also treated with opium, or sometimes mustard or quinine plasters. If that didn't work, they might try bleeding the patient, the old-timey equivalent of drinking a glass of orange juice to get rid of a cold. Only to date, orange juice hasn't killed any presidents. Malaria, another common malady, was treated with quinine. If none of that was available, they used turpentine. The aforementioned camp itch, a painful skin disease whose cause is still a topic of debate in modern medicine, was treated by ridding the body of the pests or with a solution of poke root. Dead tissue surrounding an infection would sometimes be covered in maggots to eat away the necrotic skin. The hope here was that healthy tissue would then grow in its place. Now you can start to understand why all those hospitals needed to be in breezy tents. And if you got shot, well, they'd probably just offer you some whiskey to kill the pain. Unfortunately for a lot of their patients, Civil War-era medical professionals weren't too savvy about things like germs, so they didn't use sterilization or really any hygienic techniques. Doctors didn't wash their hands between patients, wore filthy, blood-stained garments from one surgery to the next, and usually operated with unclean surgical instruments. That is, when they used surgical instruments at all. Reports of doctors probing wounds with bloody fingers or using dirty knives as scalpels were not uncommon, and surgical sponges would be lucky to get as much as a rinse between patients. Not surprisingly, infection and disease ran rampant through such facilities. Even worse, the unsanitary conditions contributed to the rise of a necrotizing fasciitis known as hospital gangrene. Nearly half of patients who contracted gangrene perished as a result. Unfortunately, not every soldier could be saved, and a lack of manpower, time, and equipment meant that tough decisions had to be made. If a soldier was shot in the stomach, head, or chest area, it likely meant they wouldn't survive. So doctors would not operate on them, the logic being that the already scarce medical resources required would effectively be wasted. These poor souls were kept as comfortable as possible with medication, but were basically left to perish so that stronger soldiers could be treated instead. Sounds kind of like an HMO. However, if a soldier was wounded in the arm or leg, their chances of survival were deemed higher, and they would get some attention from a physician. At that point, if you were in the north, the surgeon would wash out the wound with a sponge. In the south, where sponges ran out fast, they typically used a cloth. The doctor would next probe the wound with his finger, looking for bits of cloth, bone, or the bullet itself. If the bone was broken or a major blood vessel had been torn, the surgeon would usually recommend an amputation, the closest thing to a mascot the Civil War had. For Civil War surgeons, amputation was one of the most frequently performed surgical procedures. Historians estimate that over 60,000 amputations were carried out during the conflict. In fact, it was so common that the patients started calling the doctors sawbones. According to Star Trek, this nickname would endure well into the 23rd century. Patients would be given anesthetic in the form of chloroform, which is pretty effective, but there was a downside. If the dose wasn't measured correctly, the chloroform could cause fatal cardiac arrest. Such cases were rare, reportedly only accounting for 0.4% of the total lives lost during the war. Nonetheless, chloroform is not considered safe by modern medical standards and is no longer in use. Given these operations were being performed under battlefield conditions, they had to be done fast. An experienced surgeon, who often worked alone due to chronic understaffing, could remove a limb in 10 minutes. They presumably included their best times on their business cards. These doctors often worked all night, with piles of amputated limbs reaching 4 or 5 feet in some cases. That's 4 or 5 feet as in depth, not feet as in feet. Despite the extreme conditions, 75% of amputees survived. However, that still meant a quarter of amputee patients perished. All the decaying corpses and body parts often made the smell of putrefying flesh completely overwhelming, doubly so in hot weather. So, long story short, there's a reason Yankee Candle doesn't make a Gettysburg surgery scent. Not all of the surgeons were experienced. In fact, it was quite the opposite. Since medical standards were very different in those days, students were able to complete medical school much quicker. This meant that many of the battlefield surgeons were essentially job shadowing. In fact, of the roughly 11,000 Northern doctors, just 500 had performed surgery before. In the Confederacy, the numbers were even worse. Just 27 of their 3,000 doctors had surgical experience. And even if the doctor was experienced, there was a non-zero chance that they might have been drunk. Alcohol, like whiskey, was often used as an anesthetic, which meant there could be a lot of it lying around. Soldiers were known to report that some of the surgeons were drinking the whiskey and operating under the influence. The military took these accusations seriously, dismissing doctors who were found to be drunk on the job. The only person allowed to be drunk on the job during the Civil War was Ulysses S. Grant. Despite how well documented the era was, many myths about medical care during the war still persist to this day. For example, many movies would have you believe that amputations were carried out without the use of anesthesia, but as previously mentioned, that's not the case. In fact, anesthesia, first used in 1846, was common by the time of the Civil War, and there are over 80,000 recorded cases of its use. So why do so many believe it wasn't used? No one is certain. But at least one medical historian believes it may be because the anesthesia was so light, many soldiers assumed none was being used at all. Which, in fairness, sounds like the same thing as not using anesthesia. It is also widely believed that the treatments used in Civil War hospitals were substandard even for the time. However, other than treating malaria with quinine, pain with opiates, and vaccinating against smallpox, there were no specific general therapies. No one knew what was causing disease, or what those diseases were doing to the body. So the medical care the soldiers received was, in fact, the best available, even if it was kind of lame. As the casualties piled up, both the North and the South began to build general military hospitals, where soldiers could get a better class of treatment. Located mostly in bigger cities like Philadelphia, Knoxville, Washington, D.C., and Richmond, these hospitals tended to be well ventilated and heated. Good thing, too, because injured soldiers could be there for weeks or even months. Getting shot in the 19th century was like a Las Vegas residency. You're going to be stuck in the same building and high out of your mind for half the year. And whereas the field hospitals were held together by spit and polish, the general hospitals usually had it all, including kitchens, laundries, linen rooms, storerooms, chapels, and offices. Being much further from the front lines, general hospitals were much less chaotic. The staff spent most of their time cleaning, cooking, emptying bedpans, and administering medicines. And presumably, the doctors did not begin each amputation by starting a stopwatch. So what do you think? Could you have survived working in a Civil War field hospital? Let us know in the comments below, and while you're at it, check out some of these other videos from our weird history.